My number 7 best chess game of the 1970s is Emil Diemer vs. Joe Trommsdorf from 1973. This game answers the question, what if an actual certified, institutionalized madman played chess? That man is Emil Diemer, the player of the white pieces. He is one of the 2 players for whom the Blackmar-Diemer gambit is named, and in a far sadder and darker part of his life, he was also the official chess reporter of the Third Reich. In the description, I have a link to a short biography that includes a lot of good and unvarnished information about him. On the other side of the board, we have Trommsdorf, not a player who I know much about, but in this game, he is going to play one of the most insane and brilliant moves that you are ever going to see. This whole game is interesting and dramatic and worthy of our time, but I already know that there are so many brilliant moves in the final third of the game that I'm going to need most of my time for that, so we are going to speedrun the first 25 moves. The game opens with d4, and we know that if d5, Diemer would have played e4, the Blackmar-Diemer gambit. Instead, after knight f6, the opening is going to transpose into a modern g6, e4, d6, bishop e2, c6, and now g4. Gary the G-pawn is sent up the board. I'm sure that Simon Williams, the Ginger GM, would approve. He would even more approve of 2 moves later, sending Harry the H-pawn up the board as well. This is a very aggressive approach. I don't usually recommend something like this for beginners, but in this case, it's probably quite reasonable. Now b4, knight back to b1, pawn to d5, and it's already good to continue forward, but e5 in this position. e6, and now h5, c5, a trade on g6, and the strong move bishop to d3. This threatens bishop takes g6 because this pawn is pinned to the rook, so bishop to g7 to defend the rook, but now a classic idea, rook takes h7. If you've never seen this idea, definitely hold on to it. You will get a chance to use it in some game in the future. Rook takes, bishop takes g6, and after the king steps up, bishop takes h7. This is a strong position for white, but it's not over yet. The exposed king on e7 is hard to get to, and the white center is a little bit crumbly. Pawn takes d4. The best move is definitely f4, holding onto the pawn on e5, and now queen h8, queen h5, bishop to a6, knight to f3, knight to c6, and knight to h4. For the first time in the game, Diemer tries to threaten a royal fork. He is going to use the idea of a royal fork many times in this game, and it is repeatedly going to be a bad idea if black responds in the best way. In this case, the best way is knight takes e5, sacrificing a knight and covering the g6 square. Now, there are a few good ideas, including rook f8 to f1, but the biggest idea that black has in this position is pawn to d3, which will open up the king and tear open the long diagonal. Suddenly, black is actually better in the positions that emerge. Instead, though, we get knight to f8, defending passively against the fork, and again, Diemer is better. Pawn to g6, king to d7, the king is running to safety, knight to d2, king to c7, and in this position, Diemer could have gotten a winning position by simply playing positionally. However, that was never his strong suit, so he misses the idea of knight back to f3. The other knight can go to b3, he'll capture on d4, and once a strong knight makes it to d4, he should really be able to win at his own leisure. The position is just that dominant for white. Instead, after king c7, the other knight goes to f3. Pay attention to the cluster of the white pieces on the king side here. As the game goes, they are just going to end up horribly, horribly misplaced over here as the action starts to develop on the queen side. Knight d7, bishop to d2, queen to f8, knight g5, threatening another royal fork, rook to e8, and now queen g4, insisting on knight takes e6, but possibly missing knight takes e5. You cannot capture this knight because of mate down here on f1. However, maybe Diemer did not miss it. He plays queen h3, and this knight is still under attack because now f1 is covered, and there's also the idea of knight takes e6 with check. So white is winning material, but white is not getting a good position out of winning material. Black has lots of good ways to give up material in this position and get a great position. Black starts well with knight c4, knight takes e6, and now the audacious move king to d7, stepping into the line of fire, but using the king to attack the pinned knight here. Now, after king to d7, f5 is played, And in this position, we actually get a mistake. Knight takes d2. I encourage you to pause your video at this point in the game and try to play like Diemer. What would this madman do? Well, Diemer castles queenside. If you had forgotten that it was even legal to castle at this point in the game, then I don't blame you at all. This is one of the most spectacular examples of castling that I've ever seen. It is move 29 and there is chaos on the board. Additionally, this move is very strong. There's still the idea of capturing this hanging knight, a knight that we left hanging instead of capturing it by playing king takes d2, and we are threatening knight takes f8 and knight takes g7. So after queen f6, moving the queen to safety, knight takes g7 looks crushing. There's the idea of capturing this rook here, and of course, if the queen captures, then there's f6 with the discovered check, and the black queen falls, and the game is over. So after knight takes g7, Trommsdorf finds the best move. It is the move rook to e3, attacking the white queen. At this point, we get the first of multiple examples of both queens being left hanging. Knight to h5. This counterattacks the black queen and threatens to take it with check. There is no circumstance where both queens can leave the board and we can actually be okay with black. The problem is that in addition to other tactical issues, these connected passed pawns will always win the game. There's also a hanging knight here on d2. This position is plus 10. So after knight to h5, queen g5 is played. There's a bit of an ominous lineup here pointing at the king on c1, but there are a lot of pieces in the way here and it doesn't look like black has any threats. In this position, we actually see the move queen to g4, another example of both queens being placed on prise. This move looks crushing. If you capture the white queen, there is knight to f6 check, and again, with both queens leaving the board, the connected passed pawns will win the game. However, in this position, there is one move that wins the game for black, and there are an infinite number of other moves that are at least plus 10 for white. Pause your video and try to find the brilliant and beautiful move that actually works for black. Trommsdorf plays the incredible b3. Everything else is plus 10 for white, but this move wins for black. From this point to the end of this video, we are just going to be cascading through different, unique, beautiful checkmates. Now, first off, you can capture the queen here on g5, but then there is pawn takes on a2, and you cannot stop the promotion. And not only can you not stop the promotion will be checkmate. For example, king takes d2, rook to e2 check, pushing the king back into its box. And then let's just go for that brilliancy prize and under promote to a rook for the beautiful, beautiful checkmate. Now, after b3, there are, of course, other options. The queens can continue to be left hanging over here. And so we can try, for example, pawn to a3, stopping the capture and promotion. At this point, there are multiple good moves, but my favorite is absolutely rook c3, leaving the queen hanging again. But if you take rook takes c2 is checkmate. But you could capture the rook instead of the queen, so pawn takes c3, and now d takes c3, leaving the queen hanging again, but queen takes g5 leads to b2, a different and great checkmate. So you could, you could play c takes b3, capturing the pawn instead, leaving the queens hanging, and now bishop to d3. Absolutely incredible. And again, if queen takes g5, there is a new checkmate on the board. Knight takes b3, checkmate. I am just blown away by the idea of continuing to leave the queen hanging on g5 and for 3 moves in a row, reintroducing unique and basically unstoppable checkmating ideas. Absolutely stunning. So let's also consider here the idea of capturing on b3 with the c pawn. So c takes b3. Now, I've basically got pages of analysis here. If you want to see all of the analysis, then check out my blog that is linked in the comment below, but I'm just going to show highlights. So after c takes b3, we can play knight takes b3 in this position. Now, the king could move, but let's first consider the capture of the knight. A takes b3. Now we can give the double check here with rook to c3 check. If the king moves over, which is forced because it's double check from the queen and the rook, there is bishop to d3 check. If you move the king over, king to a2, then there's knight to b4 check, king up, attacking the knight, and we don't mind that you attack the knight. We are going to play rook c6, leaving the knight and the queen hanging. Rook c6 is a beautiful move. If queen takes g5, then knight c2 check, and this is a mate with the bishop and the knight covering these squares. And if the king falls back instead, then there is rook to a6, king back to b1, and rook to a1 and checkmate. I've got a lot more here in the variation with c takes b3, but I'm going to encourage you to check out the blog if you want all of those. In the game after b3, the a pawn captures, a takes b3, and now there are two winning ideas. Possibly the strongest, if you find it, is the move knight to b4. And if you capture the queen, something I'm going to say over and over again, then there is knight to a2, king takes, and rook to e2, a great checkmate. And after knight b4, if you don't capture the queen, you're really honestly just stuck. There's still ideas of capturing here. There's ideas of capturing here, and there's just no good way to respond. Rook takes d2, rook e1 check, and then queen to d1. Only legal move leads to mate with queen g1. Mate over here. So this was a crushing idea, the idea of knight b4 in this position. Instead, what is actually played is knight takes b3, which is also winning, but more complicated. Let's consider first that if you capture here, there's rook c3, and we've already seen this idea of double check, and there's no defense to this. We saw this before in the first idea of capturing with the c-pawn without the knight being sacrificed. And again, I'll refer you to the blog if you want to see some of the incredible ideas in that version. But after knight takes b3 in the game, king to b1 is played. And now a winning idea is simply putting the knight back to d2 and then going back to the idea of knight b4. And this is the strongest way to play. Now, again, you can capture the queen, and now there is knight takes c2, king to a2, knight to b4, king to a1, knight to b3 check, king over to b1, and then bishop d3. And after rook takes, we actually have this unique kind of back rank checkmate with the doubled knights defending the rook on c1 and covering the escape squares. A wonderful checkmate. In the game, a mistake is played, but it's a very challenging and beautiful mistake. It is the move rook to d3, leaving the queen hanging and putting the rook on prise in two different ways here. Now, this move is actually a mistake, and white has a way to draw here, but it's very, very challenging, and the most tempting moves all fail. For example, if you capture the queen, then after rook takes, king up here, we can give up the knight on b3 for bishop c4 and checkmate. Really, really beautiful. And we can also consider the ideas of capturing the rook. If c takes d3 here, then there is bishop takes d3, king to a2, knight to b4 check, and you can consider both capturing and not capturing the knight. Capturing is maybe a little more straightforward, I'm not sure. Bishop c2 check, king takes b4, queen to e7 check, and the queen and king are now able to form a mating net and win the game. For example, king b5, a6 check, and you will eventually have to capture on a6, and now king c6. And this cluster of pieces over here on the king side is just in observer mode, and there's no way to defend against all of the threatened checkmates over here on the a file. The king on a6 is totally stuck. Mate in 2, and only mate in 2 if you play queen takes d4. Everything else is mate in 1. After knight to b4 check in the earlier position, you can choose not to take either knight, king to a3, and now there's the move queen to d8, and after king takes b4, you finally need to take one of the knights. There's queen to b6 check, and king to a3, and now you just need a quiet move like bishop c4, and the threats are overwhelming. So that's another way that it's possible to win the game. What should white play after the move rook to d3? Well, one of the computer's top moves is rook to h1, which is hilarious. No human is going to play that, but rook g1 is a very human move, and basically the idea is to move the attacked rook off of d1 here, and of course the white queen still cannot be captured because of knight f6, which indirectly defends the queen. So what we actually see in the game is the move queen to g1, which is a mistake, and this mistake is exploited. Knight to d2 check. And now if king c1, once again, there is knight to b4, threatening knight to a2 checkmate, and that's crushing. So knight d2 check, king a1, and now queen doubling back with queen d8, and this is strong and wins the game. There was still the idea of knight to b4, which was maybe a little bit more decisive. This move leads to checkmate, whereas queen d8 leads to a win of material. If you capture the still hanging queen on g5, there is knight to b3 check, and then you're capturing the rook here, and that is a back rank mate, which is great. And possibly, of all of the spectacular checkmates, my favorite might actually be c takes d3, capturing the rook on d3. When there is knight to b3, the king must go to b1. And now in this position, there are choices, but certainly the one I would want to make is queen to c1, and the rook captures and bishop takes, rook blocks. Bishop takes c2 and checkmate. What an incredible, incredible checkmate. After king to a1 and queen d8, black is just winning, but there are some unique things that are going to happen. So knight to f6 check, the king ignores the knight and just moves away from that check. We're not capturing that knight. Rook takes d2, and now queen check, and finally the knight comes to b4. This knight has been wanting to go to b4. It finally gets there, and the idea is a decisive one. Rook takes d3, so at least the king is not getting checkmated. Queen a2 check, and king c1. And in this position, Trommsdorf should just cash in on his absolutely brilliant play with pawn to b3, and he should play queen to a1 check, king up, and queen takes g1. This is decisive. Instead, I'm hoping he's in time trouble, even though it's move 41, and usually you would get more time at move 40. He plays knight takes d3. Now, if you take the knight, then I'm going to win your queen again, and it's all good. Black wins. But king d2, the king just moves out of the way, and this has been a huge mistake. Suddenly, it is Diemer who is winning. Queen to a5 check, just basically desperation, giving the only check available. And after queen to a5 check, you really need to play c3. I understand the reluctance to do this because after pawn takes, the second rank opens, but queen check and then king e3 leads to no additional checks. There is nothing to do in this position. We do not have queen f2 because that square is covered. Otherwise, it would be checkmate. So c3 would actually have won the game. Instead, after queen a5 check, we get king to e2. And now, incredibly enough, it is a draw. Knight to e5 check. And so the king moves over to f2, but that allows the queen to come into d2 with check. The king can only go to g3, and now queen g5 check. And because the king must continue to defend the queen, and you cannot go to h2 without dropping a knight, the king goes back. And so we have a perpetual, and it is actually in this position that this insane game ends. This is just so crazy. There is a commenter on Chess Games who describes watching this game live, and basically all of the spectators were just standing around watching the game finish, just slack-jawed, and I'm sure I would have been in the same state, just sitting there stunned if I was able to watch this game live. Now, if you like this game, then you're also going to like the other best of the 1970 games that I've already done or that I am soon to do, so please do click on that playlist that is sitting right on top of your screen.